The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Riverside Avenue, where Dylan Sanders wiped the sweat from his brow with an oil-stained rag. His small motorcycle repair shop, Sanders Motors, looked tired and worn, just like its owner. At 28, Dylan had already seen more hardship than most people twice his age. The rusty sign above his shop creaked in the hot breeze, its paint peeling away like old memories. Inside the cramped garage, 3 motorcycles waited for repairs that their owners couldn't afford to pay for immediately. Dylan's calloused hands moved expertly over a Yamaha engine, coaxing life back into its worn cylinders. "Another day, another dollar, and that I don't have," he muttered to himself, the irony not lost on him. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that breakfast had been a luxury he couldn't afford this morning. The stack of unpaid bills on his desk seemed to mock him from across the garage. Rent notice. Final warning, electric bill past due, water bill, service disconnection imminent. Dylan's fingers trembled slightly as he tightened a bolt, not from nervousness, but from exhaustion. He'd been working 18-hour days for the past month, trying to keep his dream alive. This shop wasn't just his livelihood. It was his father's legacy. Marcus Sanders had built this place from nothing, working with his bare hands to create something meaningful in a neighborhood that had forgotten what hope looked like. When a drunk driver took his father's life 2 years ago, Dylan inherited more than just a business. He inherited a responsibility to his community, to the kids who looked up to him, to the elderly customers who trusted him with their only means of transportation. "I won't let you down, Pop," Dylan whispered, looking at the faded photograph of his father mounted on the wall. The image showed a proud black man in work overalls, standing next to a perfectly restored vintage Harley-Davidson. The bell above the shop door chimed weakly, interrupting his thoughts. Dylan looked up to see Mrs. Rodriguez, his 70-year-old neighbor, struggling to push her ancient moped through the entrance. "Dylan, mijo, I'm so sorry to bother you again," she began, her voice heavy with embarrassment. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you know you're never a bother," Dylan said warmly, immediately moving to help her with the moped. "What's she doing to you now? She won't start again and I have to get to work at the hospital tonight. I know I still owe you from last month, but—" Dylan held up his hand gently. "Don't worry about that right now, let me take a look." As he knelt beside the old moped, Dylan's heart ached. Mrs. Rodriguez worked night shifts as a hospital cleaner to support her disabled grandson. She needed this moped more than he needed her payment. 30 minutes later, the moped purred to life. "How much do I owe you, mijo?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, clutching her worn purse. "Just promise me you'll be careful riding home tonight," Dylan said, refusing to meet her eyes. He couldn't take money from someone who needed it more than he did. As Mrs. Rodriguez rode away, tears streaming down her cheeks from gratitude, Dylan returned to his workbench. The stack of bills seemed even taller now, but somehow his heart felt a little lighter. He didn't know that across the street, hidden behind tinted windows of a luxury sedan, someone had been watching his every move. The next morning arrived with the promise of another sweltering day. Dylan had spent the night on the old couch in his office, unable to afford the gas money to drive to his apartment and back. His neck ached from the uncomfortable position, but he'd grown used to these small sacrifices. He was bent over a stubborn carburetor, completely absorbed in his work, when the sound of expensive heels clicking against concrete made him look up. Through the grimy window, he caught a glimpse of someone approaching his shop. The woman who entered seemed to belong to a different world entirely. She was elegant, poised, with porcelain skin that seemed to glow despite the harsh fluorescent lighting of the garage. Her platinum blonde hair was styled in a sleek bob that framed delicate features, and her business attire was impeccable. A tailored blazer that probably cost more than Dylan made in 3 months, paired with designer jeans that somehow managed to look both casual and sophisticated. But it was her eyes that caught Dylan's attention, bright blue and intelligent. Yet despite her composed exterior, there was something vulnerable lurking behind them, something that spoke of disappointment, of walls built high to keep the world at bay. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth and cultured with just a hint of nervousness. "Are you the owner?" Dylan straightened up, suddenly aware of the oil stains on his work shirt and the smell of motor oil that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. The contrast between them was stark, his dark skin glistening with honest sweat, her pale complexion untouched by manual labor. "Yes, ma'am. Dylan Sanders. How can I help you?" The woman, who looked to be in her mid-30s, gestured toward the street. "I have a motorcycle that's giving me trouble. It's been making strange noises, and this morning it just died." Dylan followed her outside, and his jaw nearly dropped. Parked on the street was a pristine Ducati Monster, sleek, black, and worth more than his entire shop's inventory combined, but even from a distance he could hear the telltale clicking sound of a timing chain problem. "Beautiful bike," Dylan said, running his eyes over the machine with professional appreciation. "When did the noises start?" "About a week ago," the woman replied, introducing herself simply as Stella. She watched carefully as Dylan approached the motorcycle, noting how his demeanor changed from nervous social interaction to confident professional assessment. Dylan's hands moved over the bike with practiced expertise, listening to the engine, checking connections, testing various components. Within 10 minutes, he had diagnosed the problem. "Your timing chain tensioner is failing," he explained, looking up at Stella. "It's not uncommon on these models, but it needs to be addressed quickly. If it goes completely, you could have serious engine damage." Stella nodded, impressed by his quick and accurate diagnosis. "How much would something like that cost to repair?" Dylan did some quick mental calculations. The part alone would cost around $800, and the labor would typically run another $400. For someone driving a $15,000 motorcycle, it shouldn't be a problem. "Well," Dylan began carefully, "the part runs about $800, and labor would normally be around $400, so about $1,200 total." He watched Stella's face carefully, expecting the usual wealthy customer reaction, mild annoyance at the expense but ultimate acceptance. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like relief. "I see," Stella said slowly. "And how long would it take?" "I could have it done by tomorrow afternoon if I can get the part delivered by morning." Stella paused, seeming to weigh her options. Then she did something that surprised Dylan completely. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice taking on a slightly embarrassed tone. "I know this might sound strange, but I'm actually in a bit of a tight spot financially right now. Is there any way we could work out some kind of payment plan?" Dylan stared at her, confused. Everything about this woman screamed money, from her clothes to her jewelry to the fact that she owned a Ducati, but the vulnerability in her voice seemed genuine. "Of course," he heard himself saying, "we can figure something out." What Dylan didn't know was that Stella King, billionaire CEO of King Industries, had been testing people throughout the city for the past month. Wealthy contractors who refused work without full payment up front, expensive restaurants that wouldn't serve someone who claimed to be short on cash, high-end stores where she was treated dismissively when she hesitated at prices. She had lost faith in human kindness. Convinced that everyone was motivated solely by money, Dylan Sanders was about to prove her wrong. That evening, Dylan sat alone in his shop, staring at the Ducati and wrestling with a decision that could make or break him. The parts supplier had quoted him $850 for the timing chain tensioner, $50 more than he'd estimated. With labor, the job would cost him nearly $900 out of pocket, $900 he didn't have. His phone buzzed with yet another text from his landlord. "Rent payment overdue. Need payment by Friday or start eviction process." Dylan looked at his bank account on his phone screen. $314,082. That was it. That was all that stood between him and losing everything his father had built. The smart business decision was obvious. Call Stella, explain that he couldn't do the work without payment up front, apologize for the inconvenience. Any reasonable person would understand. But as Dylan studied Stella's motorcycle in the dim light of his shop, he remembered something about the way she'd asked about the payment plan. There had been genuine worry in her voice, real concern about the cost, and despite her expensive appearance, he recognized something familiar in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in his own mirror too many times lately, the look of someone trying to hold it all together when everything was falling apart. "Damn it, Pop," Dylan muttered to the photograph on the wall. "You always said to treat people the way you'd want to be treated, but what if doing the right thing costs us everything?" His father's image seemed to smile back at him knowingly. Dylan pulled out his phone and dialed the parts supplier. "Yeah, it's Dylan Sanders. I need that Ducati timing chain tensioner first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, I know it's $850. Put it on my account." He hung up and immediately called his credit card company. Knowing he was about to max out his last available line of credit, the automated system cheerfully informed him that his purchase had been approved, and his remaining available credit was now $73. "Well," Dylan said to the empty shop, "I guess we're all in now." The next morning, Dylan arrived at his shop before sunrise. He'd barely slept, partly from anxiety about his financial situation, but mostly from excitement about working on such a beautiful machine. The Ducati was the kind of motorcycle he'd dreamed of owning someday, engineering perfection wrapped in Italian elegance. As he began disassembling the engine, Dylan found himself lost in the meditative rhythm of precision work. This was what he lived for, the challenge of solving mechanical puzzles, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. Around noon, his concentration was broken by the sound of someone clearing their throat. Dylan looked up from the motorcycle's exposed engine to find Stella standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and a bag from the deli down the street. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, seeming almost shy. Her blonde hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around her pale features. "I know this is probably unprofessional, but you're doing me such a huge favor and I wanted to thank you somehow." Dylan wiped his hands on a rag and accepted the coffee gratefully. "That's really thoughtful of you, but you don't need to—" "Please," Stella interrupted gently, her blue eyes meeting his dark ones with surprising intensity. "Let me do this." They sat together on a pair of overturned crates, sharing sandwiches and coffee, while Dylan explained what he was doing to repair the motorcycle. Stella listened intently, asking intelligent questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding the process. "You really love this work, don't you?" she observed, watching how Dylan's entire demeanor changed when he talked about motorcycles. There was something captivating about watching his strong, skilled hands gesture as he explained the intricacies of the engine. "It's all I've ever known," Dylan admitted. "My father taught me everything. How to listen to what an engine is telling you. How to feel when something's not quite right. He used to say that every machine has a soul and our job is to understand what it needs." Sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He built this place from nothing, made it mean something to the community. People trusted him. Dylan's voice grew quieter. "I just hope I can live up to that." Stella studied Dylan's face as he spoke, seeing something that had become rare in her world. Genuine humility and integrity. Here was a man who could have easily refused to help her, who was clearly struggling financially, yet he'd chosen kindness over self-preservation. The contrast between his warm, generous spirit and her cold, calculating business world struck her profoundly. "I'm sure he'd be proud of you," she said softly, meaning every word as Dylan returned to work on her motorcycle. Stella made a mental note to herself. Tomorrow she would make a phone call that would change Dylan Sanders' life forever. But first, she needed to see how this story would end. By late afternoon, Dylan had successfully replaced the timing chain tensioner and was running final tests on the Ducati. The engine purred with mechanical perfection, its irregular rhythm now replaced by smooth, confident power. Despite his financial worries, he felt the familiar surge of pride that came from a job well done. Stella returned just as Dylan was cleaning the last traces of oil from the motorcycle's sleek black surface. She moved differently now, Dylan noticed. Less guarded, more relaxed. The expensive business attire had been replaced by simple jeans and a cream-colored sweater that complemented her fair complexion. Yet, she somehow looked even more elegant. "How does she sound?" Stella asked, running her delicate hand along the motorcycle's fuel tank with obvious affection. "Like a dream," Dylan replied, starting the engine. The Ducati responded instantly, its distinctive L-twin engine note filling the garage with beautiful mechanical music. Whatever was wrong before, it's completely gone now. Stella's face lit up with genuine joy, her blue eyes sparkling with delight. "Dylan, you're amazing. I can't tell you how much this means to me." "Just doing my job," Dylan said modestly, though he couldn't hide his pleasure at her reaction. Then came the moment he'd been dreading. Stella reached into her purse, and Dylan felt his stomach clench with anxiety. They hadn't discussed specifics about the payment plan, and he hadn't wanted to pressure her. "About the payment," Stella began, and Dylan saw what looked like genuine distress cross her delicate features. "I feel terrible about this, but I'm afraid I can only give you $200 right now. I know it's nowhere near what you quoted, but—" "Hey, it's okay," Dylan interrupted quickly, seeing how uncomfortable she was. "200 is fine for now. We can work out the rest later." "Are you sure? I mean, you said the parts alone cost $800. Dylan looked at this woman, this stranger who'd wandered into his life barely 24 hours ago, and made a decision that defied all business logic. Something about her vulnerability, the way she seemed genuinely distressed about not being able to pay, touched something deep in his heart. "Tell you what," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Just take the bike. We'll call it even." Stella stared at him in disbelief, her pale complexion growing even whiter. "What? No, Dylan, I can't let you—" "Look," Dylan said, leaning against the workbench, "you seem like good people, and good people help each other out when they can. Maybe someday when you're back on your feet, you can send some business my way, Or maybe you can help someone else who needs it. That's how it works, right? For a long moment, Stella said nothing. Dylan watched emotions play across her face. Surprise, confusion, something that looked almost like pain. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Dylan shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I don't know, my father always said that kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you spend it." Stella turned away abruptly, and Dylan was alarmed to see her shoulders shaking. When she turned back, there were tears glistening in her blue eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. It's been a really long time since someone was kind to me without wanting something in return." "We all need help sometimes," Dylan said gently. "Today it's you. Tomorrow it might be me." As Stella prepared to leave, she paused at the garage entrance and looked back at Dylan, who had already returned to working on another motorcycle. The late afternoon sun created a halo effect around his dark skin as he bent over the engine, completely absorbed in his work. "Dylan," she called out. "Yeah, what's your biggest dream? If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Dylan stopped working and considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I'd love to expand this place, create a training program for kids in the neighborhood, teach them real skills, maybe get some better equipment, hire a few people, give back to the community the way my father always talked about doing." "That's a beautiful dream," Stella said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "What about you?" Dylan asked. "What's your dream?" Stella was quiet for so long that Dylan thought she hadn't heard him. Finally, she spoke. "I used to dream about finding someone who would care about me for who I am, not what I could give them. I thought that was impossible." She paused, looking directly at him. "Maybe I was wrong." As the sound of the Ducati faded into the distance, Dylan returned to his workbench, unaware that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. In a downtown office building 30 miles away, Stella King was already making phone calls that would change everything. The test was complete. Dylan Sanders had passed with flying colors. Now came the reward. 3 days passed, and Dylan tried to push the strange encounter with Stella from his mind. He had bigger problems to worry about, like the eviction notice that had been taped to his shop door that morning, or the fact that his electricity would be shut off in 48 hours. He was underneath a Honda Shadow, wrestling with a stubborn brake line. When he heard the rumble of multiple motorcycles pulling up outside, Dylan slid out from under the bike, expecting to see his usual group of weekend riders who liked to hang around the shop. Instead, he found himself face to face with 3 men in expensive suits, standing next to a convoy of black SUVs. The lead man, a distinguished white gentleman with silver hair and an authoritative bearing, stepped forward. "Mr. Sanders, my name is James Mitchell, and I represent a private investor who's interested in your business." Dylan wiped his hands nervously on a rag. "I'm sorry, but I'm not looking to sell. This place belonged to my father and—" "Oh, we're not looking to buy," James interrupted with a smile. "Quite the opposite, actually. My client would like to make an investment in Sanders Motors, a significant investment." "I don't understand," Dylan said, confusion evident in his voice. James pulled out a tablet and showed Dylan an official-looking document. "My client wishes to provide you with a business loan of $500,000, interest-free, with no repayment schedule. The only condition is that you use the money to expand your operation and create community programs. As we understand, that's been a dream of yours." Dylan's knees nearly gave out. "500,000? Who is this client? What do they want in return?" "They prefer to remain anonymous for now," James replied, "and they want nothing in return except to see you succeed. Consider it an investment in the community." "This doesn't make sense," Dylan said, shaking his head. "Nobody just gives away that kind of money. What's the catch?" "No catch, Mr. Sanders. My client was impressed by your character and believes in your vision. The paperwork is already prepared. All you need to do is sign." Dylan stared at the documents, his mind racing. The amount of money being offered would solve every problem he had and fulfill every dream he'd ever harbored about the shop. But something felt off. "I need time to think about this," Dylan said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need," James said, handing him a business card. "But please don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As the convoy of black SUVs disappeared into traffic, Dylan stood in his empty shop, holding a business card that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The company name meant nothing to him. King Industries, Private Investment Division. That evening, Dylan found himself at Rosie's Diner, the local gathering spot where neighborhood folks came to share meals and gossip. He slid into a booth across from his friend Marcus Washington, a retired postal worker who'd known Dylan's father for 30 years. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," Marcus observed, signaling the waitress for another cup of coffee. Dylan told him about the mysterious offer, watching as Marcus's eyebrows climbed higher with each detail. $500,000, Marcus whistled low. "And they want nothing in return, Dylan. That sounds too good to be true." "That's what I'm thinking, but Marcus, you should see the papers. They look legitimate. The lawyer seemed real enough." Marcus stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You know, there's been talk around the neighborhood lately. Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop said some fancy woman was asking questions about you a few days ago, and old Mr. Peterson saw someone in an expensive car watching your shop." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of questions? About what kind of person you are? About how you treat your customers? How you handle your business like someone was doing research? This is getting weird, Marcus. First this stellar woman shows up with an expensive bike, then mysterious investors want to give me $500,000. "Wait," Marcus said, setting down his coffee cup. "Did you say stellar, tall, elegant white woman with blonde hair drives like she owns the road?" "Yeah, how did you—" "Son," Marcus interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I think I know who your mysterious investor might be." He pulled out his phone and showed Dylan a news article from the business section. "King Industries CEO Stella King announces new community investment initiative." Dylan stared at the photograph accompanying the article. It was her, the woman who'd brought him the Ducati, who'd sat on crates in his shop eating sandwiches and listening to him talk about his dreams. But the woman in the photo looked different, more polished, more powerful. Wearing an expensive business suit and addressing a room full of executives, Stella King, billionaire, one of the most powerful women in the country, and he'd given her a free motorcycle repair because he thought she was broke. "Oh my God," Dylan breathed. "What have I gotten myself into?" Dylan spent the entire night staring at his phone, reading every article he could find about Stella King, billionaire entrepreneur, self-made mogul who'd built King Industries from a small tech startup into a global empire, philanthropist who'd donated millions to education and community development programs, and apparently someone who disguised herself to test people's character. By morning, Dylan felt like he was living in someone else's life. The woman he'd shared coffee and sandwiches with, the woman he'd worried was struggling financially, was worth more money than he could even comprehend. He was still processing this information when a familiar black Ducati pulled up outside his shop. Dylan's heart hammered as he watched Stella King, because now he knew exactly who she was, walk through his door. She looked different today. Her blonde hair was styled more severely, and she wore a tailored business suit that emphasized her authority. Gone was the vulnerability he'd seen before, replaced by the confident bearing of someone accustomed to power. But her blue eyes, her eyes still held that same searching quality. "Hello, Dylan," she said quietly. "Miss King," Dylan replied, his voice stiffer than he intended. "I think we need to talk." Stella's face fell slightly, her pale complexion growing paler. "So you know, I know that you're one of the richest people in the country. I know that you lied to me about needing a payment plan, and I know that your people have been asking questions about me around the neighborhood. Dylan, What I don't know," Dylan continued, his voice rising with frustration and hurt, "is why, was this all some kind of game to you, some rich person's entertainment?" The words hit Stella like physical blows. She sank onto one of the crates where they'd shared lunch just days earlier, her composed facade cracking. "It wasn't a game," she said softly. "It was a test, but not the kind you think." "A test of what?" Stella was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands when she spoke. Her voice was thick with emotion. 3 months ago I thought I was getting married. David seemed perfect, handsome, charming, everything I thought I wanted, right up until I overheard him on the phone with his friend, laughing about how he'd hit the jackpot with the King Industries heiress. Dylan felt some of his anger deflate, replaced by sympathy. "I broke it off immediately," Stella continued, "but it made me realize something terrible. I couldn't think of a single person in my life who cared about me rather than my money. Every friend, every relationship, every business interaction, it all came down to what I could provide. So you decided to test people. I wanted to find out if genuine kindness still existed. If there were people who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return." Stella looked up at Dylan, tears threatening to spill from her blue eyes. "I've been doing this for weeks, Dylan. I've been to dozens of businesses, created dozens of scenarios where I needed help. Do you know how many people passed the test before you?" Dylan shook his head. "Zero, not a single person. Contractors who wouldn't work without payment up front. Restaurants that treated me like I was trying to steal food. Store clerks who followed me around like I was going to shoplift. Her voice broke. I was starting to believe that kindness was extinct. And then you walked into my shop, Dylan said, understanding beginning to dawn. And you gave me hope, Stella whispered. When you told me to just take the motorcycle, when you said that kindness multiplies when you spend it, Dylan, you gave me something worth more than all my money combined. You gave me faith in humanity again. Dylan sat down heavily on the other crate, processing everything she'd told him. The contrast between them was striking. His dark skin and work clothes against her pale complexion and expensive suit, yet somehow in this moment, those differences seemed to fade away. The investment offer, he said finally, is real, every penny of it, but not because I pity you or because I think you need saving. It's because you proved that there are still people in this world who choose to be good, even when it costs them something. But Stella, you don't owe me anything. I didn't help you because I expected a reward. I know, she said, smiling through her tears. That's exactly why you deserve it. Dylan looked around his father's shop, imagining what $500,000 could do, the training programs he could create, the jobs he could provide, the young people he could mentor. But more than that, he thought about the woman sitting across from him, powerful, wealthy, successful, and utterly alone. I have a question, Dylan said. Anything. When you asked me about my dreams the other day, I told you about expanding the shop, creating programs for kids. But what I didn't tell you is that I've been dreaming about something else too. Stella looked at him curiously. I've been dreaming about finding someone real, someone who sees past the oil stains and the struggle, who understands why this work matters to me, someone who values the same things I do. And Dylan stood up and extended his hand to her. Stella King, would you like to get some real coffee with me? Not as a billionaire and the guy who fixed her bike, but as two people who are tired of being lonely. Stella stared at his outstretched hand for a moment, then took it with a smile that transformed her entire face. I thought you'd never ask. 6 weeks had passed since that pivotal conversation in Dylan's shop, and everything had changed. The investment from King Industries had transformed Sanders Motors into something Dylan's father could never have imagined. A gleaming facility with state-of-the-art equipment, expanded workspace, and a dedicated training center where local teenagers learned valuable mechanical skills. But the most significant change in Dylan's life had nothing to do with money. You're burning the eggs again, Stella called out from the small apartment above the shop, which Dylan had converted into a proper living space. I'm not burning them, I'm crisping them, Dylan called back, expertly flipping what were definitely slightly burned eggs in the pan. Stella appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing one of Dylan's old work shirts over her pale skin, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, looking more beautiful than any magazine cover Dylan had ever seen. Over the past month and a half, they'd been spending almost every evening together, sometimes talking until dawn about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Your definition of crisping needs work, Stella said, laughing as she took over cooking duties. Good thing I learned to cook in college. Before I could afford to eat out every night. Dylan watched her move around his small kitchen with easy familiarity and felt something he'd never experienced before. Complete contentment. Stella had proven to be everything he'd hoped for, and nothing like he'd expected, away from boardrooms and business meetings. She was funny, kind, surprisingly down to earth, and possessed a curiosity about his work that went far beyond polite interest. The Patterson kid is really taking to the training program, Dylan said, settling at the small table they'd bought together. Yesterday, he diagnosed a carburetor problem faster than I would have at his age. That's wonderful, Stella replied, placing a plate of perfectly cooked eggs in front of him. You know, I've been thinking about expanding the program. What would you say to opening similar centers in other neighborhoods? You mean franchise Sanders Motors? I mean, spread the Sanders philosophy. Teach young people valuable skills. Give them a path forward. Build community connections. We could start with 3 or 4 locations, see how they develop. Dylan studied Stella's face, seeing the genuine excitement there. One thing he'd learned about her over the past weeks was that her passion for helping others was absolutely real. The money had never changed her core values. It had just given her the means to act on them. That would be incredible, Dylan said. But Stella, I need you to know something. What? All of this, the shop expansion, the training programs, even the possibility of growing bigger, none of it means as much to me as this, he gestured between them. As us. Stella reached across the table and took his dark hand in her pale one, the contrast somehow beautiful in the morning light. Dylan Sanders, are you getting sentimental on me? Maybe I am, is that a problem? Only if you stop, she said softly. Their quiet morning was interrupted by the sound of someone banging urgently on the shop door downstairs. Dylan and Stella exchanged glances. The shop wasn't supposed to open for another 2 hours. Downstairs they found Mrs. Rodriguez standing outside with her grandson Miguel, both looking distressed. "Dylan, thank God you're here," Mrs. Rodriguez said as soon as he opened the door. "It's Miguel's motorcycle, the one he saved up to buy for his new job. He won't start and he's supposed to be at work in an hour." Miguel, 19 years old and clearly panicked, stepped forward. "I'm really sorry to bother you so early, Mr. Sanders, but this job, it's my first real job, and I can't afford to be late on my second day." Dylan looked at the young man's worried face and saw himself at that age, desperate, hard-working and terrified of losing an opportunity. "Bring it in," Dylan said without hesitation. "Let's see what we're dealing with." As Miguel wheeled his modest Honda into the shop, Stella watched Dylan transform into the skilled professional she'd first met. Within minutes, he'd identified the problem, a dead battery that could be easily jump-started and replaced. "How much will this cost?" Miguel asked nervously. Dylan was about to quote his standard battery replacement fee when he caught Stella's eye. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, her blue eyes twinkling with affection. "You know what, Miguel? Consider this a welcome to the workforce gift. Just promise me you'll pay it forward someday when you're in a position to help someone else." Miguel's eyes widened with relief and gratitude. "Mr. Sanders, thank you, I promise I will." As they watched Miguel ride off to his new job, Stella slipped her arm around Dylan's waist. "You know what I love most about you," she said. "My devastatingly good looks, my incredible cooking skills. Your heart," Stella said seriously. "You can't help yourself. When someone needs help, you give it, even when it costs you something." "Is that why you fell for a broke mechanic?" Dylan asked, pulling her closer. "I fell for a man who sees people's worth instead of their wallets. The fact that you're incredibly handsome and make me laugh every day is just a bonus." As they stood together in the morning light streaming through the shop windows, surrounded by the tools and machinery that represented Dylan's life's work, both of them felt the same thing. This was just the beginning of something extraordinary, but neither of them knew that Stella's past was about to catch up with them in a way that would test everything they'd built together. The crisis began with a phone call that shattered the peaceful morning Dylan and Stella had been sharing. Stella's phone buzzed insistently while they were reviewing blueprints for the second Sanders Motors location, and her face went pale as she read the caller ID. "I have to take this," she said. Stepping outside, Dylan watched through the window as Stella paced back and forth, her body language growing more tense with each passing minute. When she finally returned, her expression was grim. "What's wrong?" Dylan asked immediately. "That was my lawyer, David, my ex-fiancé. He's filed a lawsuit against King Industries. He's claiming that I used company resources for personal vengeance, that I've been recklessly spending corporate funds on unvetted community projects." Stella's hands shook as she set down her phone. "He's demanding a full audit of every investment I've made in the past 6 months. Dylan felt ice form in his stomach. "Including the money you invested in Sanders Motors. Especially that, Dylan. He's painting our entire relationship as some kind of charity case that I'm funding out of guilt or manipulation." Tears started forming in Stella's blue eyes. "He's claiming that I'm not mentally competent to run the company, that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than business sense. But that's ridiculous. You're the most brilliant business person I've ever met. It doesn't matter if it's true," Stella said, slumping into a chair. "What matters is that he has enough stock in King Industries to force a board review. If the board loses confidence in my leadership, they can remove me as CEO." Dylan knelt beside her chair, taking her pale hands in his dark ones. "Stella, we'll fight this. We'll prove that everything you've done has been legitimate." "You don't understand," Stella said, her voice breaking. "David knows exactly what he's doing. He's not trying to prove that the investments were wrong. He's trying to prove that I made them for personal reasons instead of business reasons. And Dylan, with us, he's not entirely wrong." The words hung between them like a toxic cloud. "You didn't invest in Sanders Motors because of me," Dylan said firmly. "You invested because you believed in the community program, because you saw the potential." "But I fell in love with you first," Stella interrupted. "Before I made the investment decision, David's lawyers are going to argue that I used company money to impress a man I was interested in. They're going to make it sound like I bought your affection." Dylan stood up abruptly. Pacing to the other side of the shop, the implication of what she was saying hit him like a physical blow. "So what are you telling me? That our relationship is going to destroy your career?" "I don't know," Stella admitted. My lawyers are saying that the best defense might be to distance myself from all the investments until the lawsuit is resolved. Show the board that I can make objective business decisions. Distance yourself, Dylan repeated slowly. What does that mean, exactly? Stella couldn't meet his eyes. It means I might have to withdraw King Industries' support from Sanders Motors. Temporarily, it means I might have to stop seeing you until this is resolved. The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan stared at the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd brought hope back into his life and felt everything crumbling around him. How long is temporarily? He asked finally. The lawsuit could take months to resolve, maybe longer. And what happens to the expansion plans? What happens to the kids in the training program? What happens to the second location we were planning? I don't know, Stella whispered. Dylan, I'm so sorry. I never thought this would happen. I never thought David would what? Use our relationship against you, Stella. You're a billionaire businesswoman dating a mechanic from the wrong side of town. Didn't you consider that might have consequences? The moment the words left his mouth, Dylan regretted them, but the hurt and fear were talking now, not his heart. Dating a mechanic from the wrong side of town? Stella's voice was sharp with pain. Is that how you see yourself? Is that how you see us? Isn't that how your board is going to see it? How the media will see it? The rich white CEO and her charity case boyfriend. Stella stood up, her own anger beginning to match his. Don't you dare reduce what we have to that. What we have is real, Dylan. It's the most real thing in my life. Real enough to fight for. Real enough to risk your empire for. That's not fair, Stella said, tears streaming down her cheeks. You know what this company means to me. You know what I've sacrificed to build it. And I know what I've sacrificed to be with you, Dylan shot back. My pride, my independence, the respect of my community. Half the neighborhood thinks I'm your kept man now. The words hung in the air between them like a wall. Both Dylan and Stella realized they were saying things they didn't mean, driven by fear and frustration rather than love, but neither knew how to stop the spiral. Fine, Stella said quietly, her voice deadly calm. If that's how you feel, then maybe David is right. Maybe I've been making poor business decisions. She gathered her things and walked toward the door. Then paused. For what it's worth, Dylan, every moment with you felt like the first genuine thing I'd experienced in years. But maybe genuine isn't enough when the real world comes calling. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the shop. Dylan stood alone among the equipment and dreams they'd built together, wondering how something so right had gone so wrong so quickly. Outside, neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the telephoto lens that had been documenting their entire argument. 2 weeks had passed since Stella walked out of Dylan's shop, and the silence between them felt like a living thing. Dylan threw himself into work with desperate intensity, staying late every night to avoid the quiet apartment upstairs, where every corner held memories of their time together. The training program continued, but the planned expansion had been quietly shelved. The kids still came every afternoon, but Dylan could see the questions in their eyes, questions he couldn't answer because he didn't understand what had happened himself. It was Miguel Rodriguez who finally forced Dylan to face reality. Mr. Sanders, the young man said after a particularly intense afternoon session. Can I ask you something? Sure, Miguel, what's up? Are you okay? I mean, you've been teaching us about engines and transmissions, but you look like someone stole your favorite wrench. Despite everything, Dylan found himself smiling at Miguel's analogy. I'm fine, just dealing with some complications. Is it about Mrs. King? My grandmother said she hasn't seen her around lately. Dylan's hands stilled on the carburetor he was adjusting. It's complicated, Miguel. You know what my grandmother always says. She says that love is like a motorcycle engine. When it stops working, you don't just throw it away. You figure out what's broken and you fix it. Before Dylan could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed James Mitchell, Stella's lawyer from King Industries. Mr. Sanders, we need to meet. There have been some developments in the lawsuit that affect you directly. An hour later, Dylan sat in a downtown coffee shop across from James Mitchell, who looked grim and exhausted. David Chen has escalated his attack, James began without preamble. He's not just going after Stella anymore, he's targeting you specifically. What do you mean? James pulled out a tablet and showed Dylan a series of photographs. They were pictures of him and Stella together, sharing coffee, working in the shop, embracing outside his apartment. The images had been taken with a telephoto lens, clearly without their knowledge. David's team has been surveilling both of you for weeks. They're planning to present these photos as evidence that Stella was using company funds to support her boyfriend. Dylan felt sick, but that's not what happened. I know that and you know that, but these pictures tell a different story. They're going to argue that the entire Sanders Motors investment was a personal gift disguised as a business transaction. What does this mean for Stella? If David can prove personal motivation for the investment, it could be grounds for removing her as CEO. The King Industries board is already nervous about the lawsuit. This kind of scandal could be the final straw. Dylan stared at the photographs, seeing his private moments with Stella twisted into something sordid and calculated. There's something else, James continued. David is planning to call you as a witness. What? He wants you to testify about the nature of your relationship with Stella, about the timeline of when you met versus when the investment was made. He's betting that you'll either have to lie under oath or admit that the relationship influenced the business decision. Dylan felt trapped. Telling the truth would damage Stella's career. Lying would be perjury and could land him in jail. What does Stella want me to do? James hesitated. She doesn't know I'm here. She's been trying to handle this alone, trying to protect you from the fallout. But Dylan, she's fighting for her life here. Life. David has more resources than we initially realized, and he's playing for keeps. What can I do? There might be a way to help her, but it would require you to take a significant risk. James leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. We think David has been using insider information to manipulate King Industries stock prices. If we can prove that, it would not only discredit his lawsuit but could result in criminal charges against him. How do I help with that? David has been trying to contact you, hasn't he? Trying to get you to cooperate with his legal team? Dylan nodded. He'd been ignoring the calls and emails from David's lawyers. We want you to meet with him. Wear a wire. Let him try to bribe or coerce you into testifying against Stella. If he offers you money to lie, or threatens you if you don't cooperate, we'll have him on corruption and witness tampering charges. That's dangerous if he finds out. If he finds out, you could be in serious trouble, James admitted. But Dylan, if we don't stop him, Stella loses everything, not just her job, her reputation, her life's work, everything she's built. Dylan thought about Miguel's grandmother's advice. When something you love is broken, you don't just throw it away. You figure out how to fix it. When do we do this? James smiled for the first time since Dylan had met him. David's people called this morning. They want to meet with you tomorrow night. They think you're just a simple mechanic who can be easily intimidated or bought. They're about to find out how wrong they are, Dylan said, his voice hardening with determination. As Dylan left the coffee shop, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the photos? You're in over your head. Meet me tomorrow at 8 p.m. Riverside Hotel Bar. Come alone. We can help each other. DC. Dylan stared at the message, knowing that tomorrow night would determine not just his future with Stella, but whether the woman he loved would survive the biggest fight of her life. Time to find out what he was really made of. The Riverside Hotel Bar was exactly the kind of place Dylan had expected David Chen to choose. Expensive, dimly lit, and full of people who looked like they traded secrets for a living. Dylan adjusted the tiny recording device hidden beneath his shirt, James Mitchell's final instructions echoing in his head. Get him to make specific threats or offers. We need clear evidence of corruption. David Chen was already waiting in a corner booth, and Dylan recognized him immediately from the photos Stella had shown him months ago. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confident smile that belonged to someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. Dylan Sanders, David said, standing to shake hands. Thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing for you. Confusing is one word for it, Dylan replied. Sitting across from David and trying to keep his voice steady, David signaled the bartender for 2 drinks. I imagine Stella has painted me as some kind of villain in all this, but the truth is, I'm trying to save her from herself. Save her how? Dylan, you seem like a decent guy, hard-working, honest, trying to make something of yourself, but you have to understand Stella is using you. Dylan forced himself to look surprised rather than angry. What do you mean? The investment in your shop, the expansion plans, all of it. It's not because she believes in your business. It's because she's having some kind of midlife crisis, trying to prove she's still connected to real people. David's tone made it clear what he thought of real people. You're her charity project, her way of feeling good about herself. That's not how it seemed to me. David leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. Of course it didn't. She's very good at making people feel special. But Dylan, ask yourself this. Why would a billionaire businesswoman invest $500,000 in a tiny motorcycle shop? The numbers don't add up unless there's a personal motivation. Maybe she saw potential that others missed. Or maybe she saw a handsome, struggling black mechanic and decided to play white savior. David pulled out his phone and showed Dylan one of the surveillance photos. This picture was taken 2 days before she made the investment decision. You're telling me that's a coincidence? Dylan stared at the photo. Him and Stella sharing coffee in his shop, both of them smiling. The timing looked damning even though Dylan knew the truth. Here's what I'm prepared to offer you, David continued. Testify truthfully about when you met Stella versus when she made the investment. Admit that your personal relationship influenced her business decision. In return, I'll make sure you keep every penny of her investment, plus an additional $200,000 for your trouble. You want me to testify against her? I want you to tell the truth. Stella made an emotional decision that violated her fiduciary duty to King Industries shareholders. Help us prove that, and you'll be financially secure for life. Dylan pretended to consider the offer. And if I don't? David's friendly demeanor shifted slightly. Well, that would be unfortunate, see, Dylan. I've done my research on you. Your shop is entirely dependent on Stella's investment. Without it, you'd lose everything. The expansion, the training programs, probably the original shop too, and there might be tax implications from accepting such a large gift without proper documentation. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. You're a small fish in a very big pond. Stella dragged you into this mess, but I can get you out of it. All you have to do is tell the truth about how your relationship really started. Dylan felt the weight of the recording device against his chest. David had just offered him a bribe and threatened him with financial ruin, exactly what James had hoped for. I need time to think about this, Dylan said. Of course, but don't take too long. The deposition is scheduled for next week. David stood up, throwing money on the table. Dylan, I know you care about Stella, but she's going down whether you help or not. The question is whether you go down with her or whether you take the lifeline I'm offering. As David walked away, Dylan remained in the booth, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. He'd gotten what they needed, but hearing Stella's relationship described as manipulation and charity still hurt. His phone buzzed with a text from James. Did you get it? Got everything? Dylan typed back 20 minutes later. Minutes. Dylan was back in James's office, watching the lawyer's face light up as he listened to the recording. This is perfect, James said. Clear bribery, clear threats, clear corruption. We can have David arrested tomorrow. What happens next? Tomorrow morning, we file criminal charges against David Chen and present this evidence to the King Industries board. By the afternoon, Stella will be cleared of all charges, and David will be facing federal prosecution. Dylan felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by uncertainty. James, what about Stella and me? Even if David is discredited, the timeline of our relationship is still going to raise questions. James smiled. Dylan, do you know what the board is going to care about most when they hear this recording? What? That Stella King chose wisely. She invested in a man with enough integrity to risk his own safety to protect her, even after they'd had a falling out. That's not the action of someone who was just using her for money. That's the action of someone who genuinely loves her. For the first time in weeks, Dylan allowed himself to hope. There's just one more thing you need to do, James said. What? You need to call Stella. She doesn't know about tonight, and she deserves to hear what happened from you. Dylan stared at his phone, knowing that the next conversation would determine not just Stella's professional future, but their personal one as well. 2 hours later, Dylan stood outside Stella's downtown penthouse, his heart pounding. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, he found Stella waiting for him in the hallway, her blue eyes red from crying. Dylan, she whispered, and suddenly they were in each other's arms, all the hurt and anger of the past 2 weeks melting away. I'm so sorry, Dylan said into her blonde hair. I said terrible things. We both did, Stella interrupted. But Dylan, what you did tonight, James told me everything. You risked your safety to save my company. I risked it to save you, Dylan corrected. Stella, I don't care about your money or your company or any of it. I care about you. The woman who sat on crates in my shop and listened to me talk about my dreams. The woman who makes terrible coffee but perfect eggs. The woman who sees worth in people that everyone else overlooks. Stella pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Dylan Sanders, are you asking me to choose you over my empire? I'm asking you to choose us over fear, choose love over what other people think, choose the life we can build together over the life other people expect you to live? What if the board still has doubts, what if there's still a scandal? Dylan took her hands in his, marveling again at the contrast between their skin tones, at how perfectly they fit together despite coming from such different worlds. Then we'll face it together, Stella. You taught me that kindness multiplies when you spend it, but love Love multiplies when you share it, and I want to share mine with you for the rest of my life. As the sun rose over the city the next morning, Dylan and Stella stood together on her balcony, watching the world wake up below them. The news was already breaking. David Chen arrested for corporate espionage and attempted bribery. King Industries stock soaring on news of the CEO's vindication, but neither of them was watching the financial reports. They were too busy planning their future. A future that would include more Sanders Motors locations, more community programs, and a wedding that would bring together two worlds that had seemed impossible to bridge. 6 months later, at the grand opening of the 5th Sanders Motors Community Training Center, Dylan stood before a crowd of politicians, business leaders, and neighborhood kids, his arm around his wife Stella, the little girl who had inspired his father's photograph, showing a proud black man and a beautiful white woman working side by side, finally made sense. Love, it turned out, really was the only currency that multiplied when you spent it, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, it could change the world. 3 years later, Miguel Rodriguez graduated from the Sanders Motors Advanced Technical Program and opened his own shop in East Los Angeles. Mrs. Rodriguez still brought Dylan homemade tamales every Christmas and still refused to let him pay for them. Dylan and Stella's foundation had opened 27 training centers across the country, providing technical education to over 3,000 young people from underserved communities, and every evening, when Dylan came home with oil under his fingernails and Stella returned from boardroom battles, they still sat together in their kitchen, sharing coffee and dreams, proving every day that the best investments are the ones you make in each other. Love, after all, always pays the highest dividends.